All right, well, thank you so much. Thanks for having me back, and it's great to be with you again. I'm gonna share my screen, and as I do, I want to say again today that I hope that you'll interrupt me with whatever questions arise for you. I'm gonna be talking about sort of a continuation of what I was talking about last time. So if you weren't here last time, let me just say that what we talked about was this pattern across ancient culture in the New Testament period, where we see social norms that state that women are inferior to men, or that women aren't able to do X, Y, and Z. But on the other hand, we see a lot of evidence where women are active leaders of various sorts. They own property, they act as patrons, they serve in civic and religious roles in their communities. And so, yeah, the evidence seems to not point towards this other pattern that we've seen. And it can leave us feeling somewhat confused. So today I want to talk about how to understand those two sort of disparate parts of the ancient evidence, and by talking about gendered virtues and what being a virtuous woman, a good woman, actually meant in the ancient world. I think if we have a better understanding of this, we'll see that women's virtues supported both of these things. Actually, there was an ideal that women were subordinate to men, but that did not preclude women's leadership, oddly enough. And we've been wrong in assuming that ideals of silence, for example, meant that women never spoke or never led. But in fact, that was not the case. What you may have heard people say about this twofold evidence of women leading and women being inferior to men is to divide it into different groups. So what we've said things like, well, elite women could lead, but lower class women could not. Or we've said that Greek women could lead, or Roman women, but Jewish women could not. When it gets a little further into the early Christian period, we've said that heretical women could lead, but Orthodox women could not. And I want to suggest to you that none of those divisions work, because in each case, what we find is that the evidence that we see, the twofold evidence of women's restrictions and women's leadership, it occurs in each of those categories, the same twofold kinds of evidence. So this doesn't work to try to divide women up like that. Instead, we see that the culture itself has this tension within it, where we see both the restrictive language and women doing all kinds of stuff. So we want to have a different explanation for what's happening in ancient culture that can help us account for that, and then to help us relate it to the evidence that we see in the New Testament, where we find the same twofold kinds of evidence, of course. All right, so last time, you're not required to remember this, but last time I showed you two inscriptions about a woman named Junia Theodora, who was a contemporary of Paul in Corinth and had helped people from her own community there and was praised in a number of inscriptions. This is one of them. I showed this inscription to you last time. The people of Patara have decreed, since Junia Theodora, a Roman living at Corinth, a woman of the greatest honor, living modestly, who is a friend of the Lycians and has dedicated her life to earning the gratitude of all the Lycians, has bestowed numerous benefits also on many of our citizens. And it goes on to keep praising her. And what I noted last time, and I want to point out again here, is that Junia is a patron of these people, a woman of great honor, but she is also praised using conventional virtues for women. In particular, the phrase living modestly. That word modesty shows up in a lot of similar kinds of inscriptions and other sorts of documents. It is a traditional virtue of women. And so the first thing I want you to see is that even in a single source like this, we have both of those components of ancient culture that I've been talking about, right? We have modesty, which sounds like a kind of restrictive virtue for women, right? It sounds like a modest woman, we imagine, like wouldn't do much, right? Wouldn't, contradict men, for example, or wouldn't go out of her home, perhaps. We don't know exactly what that might entail, But on the other hand, it's being attributed to Junia Theodora, who is actually doing all of these great things. And so we see even within one source that we have both of those things going on. So this is a common pattern, again, in an ancient world. And I want to show you another example of it that we haven't looked at before, where you see both sides of this in a single inscription. So this is an inscription praising Turia. At least that's the name that people call her by. Her name in the inscription was eliminated just because of age. So this is a really long inscription, and this is part of it. Her husband is praising her after her death, and he says, "Why should I mention your personal virtues? Your modesty, obedience, affability, and good nature, your tireless attention to woolworking, your performance of religious duties without superstitious fear, your artless elegance and simplicity of dress." So these are some of the very classic virtues of women, right? Modesty, obedience, affability, good nature, industry, tireless attention to work, woolworking. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. So Turia is described here as being like the quintessentially good woman. And it might sound like, if we only had this part, we might imagine Turia as sort of a, stay at home, support her husband kind of good person. But it turns out, if you read the whole inscription, that's not at all what her life was like. In fact, in another portion of it, her husband praises her for avenging her parents' deaths. That was when he wasn't around. It was during the Civil War period that she sort of did this on her own. But the part that I want you to read is another portion of the inscription here. He says, "I was granted a pardon by Augustus, but his colleague Lepidus opposed the pardon. When you threw yourself on the ground at his feet, not only did he not raise you up, but in fact, he grabbed you and dragged you along as if you were a slave. You were covered with bruises, but with unflinching determination, you reminded him of Augustus Caesar's edict of pardon. Although you suffered insults and cruel injuries, you revealed them publicly in order to expose him as the author of my calamities." So what seems to have happened here is that Turia's husband had been on the wrong side of the Civil War, was granted a pardon by Caesar Augustus, but this is during the period where it wasn't Augustus as the sole ruler, and Lepidus opposed the pardon. So Turia goes to Lepidus, like one of the rulers of the country, in order to intervene on behalf of her husband and insist that the pardon be recognized, which would allow her husband sort of to be back into civic life. So this is the same Turia, right? Who's like obedient and modest and all of that. And yet she's doing this, number one, very political act, right? Very public and assertive, right? She's asserting her own agency on behalf of her family, sticking up for her husband in this very straightforward way. So there were patterns of life in antiquity that meant that for Turia's husband, in praising her, he does not see this as a contradiction in terms, right? And so I think our job as people who wonder about the ancient world is to understand how these things made sense together for people in antiquity, to say that a woman could be modest or obedient and to praise her in that way, but also to acknowledge that she's doing all kinds of active things and showing leadership in various ways in her life. So why did that make sense to them? And how can we understand that as a broader pattern in the ancient world? So I've got two ways of thinking about this that I hope will help us. And one is to say that there were multiple virtues in the ancient world that shaped women's lives. And if modesty, for example, were the only thing that shaped women, then we might not expect them to be doing very much. But in fact, there were other virtues involved, right? And so when you consider the array of things that are possible for women, it makes a little bit more sense. So the first of these norms I want to talk about is modesty, which I referred to above, and I will talk about at some length today because it's quite a complex virtue in this period of time. Some meanings are similar to what we might think of today. For example, we might talk about modest dress, and the ancients also thought about modesty in terms of dress, although for them, it was somewhat different than the way that we think about it. We would think about modest dress, usually a dress that covers more of your body, for example. But for them, it was more modest display, right? Not too fancy, not too showy. So modesty referred to dress in that sort of a way. During this period of time, it was very common for women to dress in relatively elaborate ways. In this particular portrait, which is the bust of a woman who is a priestess, what I want you to notice is her hairstyle. You can't really tell that much about the clothing, which might have been elaborately colored and so forth. But having a hairstyle like this probably showed that the woman had an enslaved person who was a servant in her household and did her hair every morning, or as often as you had to do it. I don't know how often they would have to design these hairstyles, but it's a sign of one's social status to be able to have hair that looks like this. And these were very common styles in the ancient world. And being able to show your wealth through your hairstyle or your clothing or your jewelry, on the one hand, that was a good thing because it was one of the ways that you displayed the status that your family had. And so that showed that you were people of high standing in the community. You were the kinds of people that were, important to know. And that was good, right? It's good for your business. It was good for your family's political situation and all of that. So that was good. But on the other hand, people recognized that too much display was actually bad for the family and the community as a whole, right? If you were using all your resources to buy gold jewelry, for example, then there was less for the family to spend on other things and less for it to spend on the community as a whole and the kinds of acts of patronage that we talked about last week and saw women participating in. So it's sort of a both and, right? And so people of the time recognized that this modesty was actually also a virtue. Here's a quote from the philosopher Plutarch. He says, "Adornment is what adorns, and what adorns a woman is what makes her better ordered, not gold or emerald or scarlet, but whatever gives an impression of dignity, discipline, and modesty." So this idea of discipline, modesty is very similar to that. In fact, the Greek word for modesty here is sophrosune, and we often translate it as modesty, especially when it pertains to women, but it's actually a broader virtue. And what it means at its heart is self-control. So the woman who's exercising modesty over her clothing is showing self-control, right? She doesn't have to have all the fancy gold and pearls and so forth, right? Or she doesn't have to wear them all. She can exercise control over her desires for such thing. And that is good, a sign of her virtue, but it's also because, not just because she has control over her body, but because she's thinking about the good of the family and the community as a whole, and the wise use of resources for the sake of other people. And this was a really important virtue at the time, in part because during Augustus's rule, the Roman provinces were really quite wealthy. People had more access to wealth than they had in the past. Some people had lots and lots of wealth. They're like sort of like our 1% today. They were enormously wealthy people, but even regular people had some wealth. And so I think the fact that we see this showing up really frequently in the writings of the time suggests that people were concerned about it, right? What's going to happen with all of this wealth? And maybe it's just going to take our community in the wrong direction because people will start thinking only of themselves. All right, so I'll come back to modesty. Are there any questions so far about what I've been saying? All right, just unmute yourself if you have a question along the way. Let's go on and talk about another virtue for women in particular, which is industry. So women in antiquity worked really hard, and they took care of their families. They also owned businesses, as we talked about last time, and they took care of their businesses. They had social influence, and they used that on behalf of their communities. And being an industrious woman was another one of the important virtues in this period of time. If you think about how difficult it was in a pre-industrial economy to even just feed and clothe your family, so much labor goes into those things. In the New Testament period, in the cities, cloth had finally become to be available for purchase. Prior to that time, it was really sort of up to each family to make their own cloth or to purchase it, on a very local, in a very local way. But if you're familiar at all with how one actually comes by the clothing that we have, right? The carding of wool, the making thread, and all of the cleaning, dyeing, and weaving processes that come before you in between the sheep and the bolt of cloth, right? It's really a labor-intensive process, and women were in charge of most of that process in antiquity. That's the reason why we saw in Turia's inscription her tireless attention to woolworking as a phrase. And woolworking itself becomes a sort of shorthand for women's labor in the ancient period. I want to give you another example of that woolworking. Here's an inscription to Murdia. My dearest mother deserved greater praise than all others, since in modesty, propriety, chastity, obedience, woolworking, industry, and loyalty, she was on an equal level with other good women, nor takes second place to any woman in virtue, work, and wisdom in times of danger. So this is, again, a list of virtues that we really find frequently in funeral inscriptions of the time. It gives us a sense of, I don't think it gives us a sense of really who Murdia was as a person, but it gives us a sense of how people thought it was right to praise women that they thought were praiseworthy, right? So these modesty, propriety, chastity, obedience, woolworking, all of these showing up together over and over again, gives us a sense of the sort of core of what people understood a good woman to be. The virtues themselves don't give us a sense of what women's lives were like, really. From the list, for example, we would never have guessed the details about Turia's life that her husband told us. We wouldn't guess that Murdia is actually praised in this inscription because of what her son felt was her just and loyal use of her own resources. After she died, she left her money in certain ways in her bequest, and her son is praising her for the ways that she honored her family in her will, essentially. So that's not something that comes through, right, in these classical feminine virtues, but we do see how important they are. So woolworking is one that I think is important, and it shows up because it means that Murdia works hard on behalf of her family. I don't think it tells us what kind of work she does at all. She might not have really had anything to do with the actual production of clothing in her household, but it does mean to say that whatever her job was, she worked really hard at it, and she had her family's best interests in mind. Women in this period had a lot of different occupations. So wealthier women would have had business interests to look after. They would have supervised the enslaved members of the household or those who supervised them. They would have been in charge of all of that, even if they weren't doing the work directly themselves. So there are different kinds of labor that are involved, but at various levels, we have papyri, for example, that show women contracting their own labor, women who own and manage vineyards and other kinds of farms, women who are contracting themselves as wet nurses and as teachers. We even have women who show up as gladiators in the ancient period. Women are vendors in the marketplace and have, whatever their businesses were. Enslaved women also have a lot of jobs that are listed in their funeral epitaphs. They were various kinds of attendants, personal attendants within the household. They were midwives and doctors. They were clerics and had lots of different roles. So women's work in this period is not at all restricted to what we think of as household labor per se, but took them outside of the household, certainly, but also just a wide variety of actual kinds of work that women did in that period. And all of those women might be praised as wool workers, actually, right? Because they're industrious, and people want them to know that they're good women. All right, so one final virtue, which is loyalty. Loyalty was, or devotion to one's family, actually devotion to one's family, the city, and the gods all sort of went together. But all of these were prized virtues of the period, and in both women and men. But there, in certain ways, they took on a gendered character. Sexual loyalty, for example, was expected more of women, or to a different extent of women than to men, because a woman who was sexually unfaithful might end up with a child who is not her husband, right? So there's a concern about lineage and being able to identify the father of children. So there was less pressure on men to be sexually faithful to their wives, but there was some pressure on men to do that as well. But when we think about loyalty and in that sense of fidelity to one's spouse, that was certainly a virtue that was prized in women as well. But there's a larger sense of loyalty in marriage beyond just sexual fidelity, which is the ability to look at the joint interests of the household. If you have, women, wives and husbands, they both own property, they both have social influence. You can see where you could get to arrive in a situation where it will really help if they both have a shared sense of what their interests are about, right? It's not going to help if they're competing against each other in the marketplace, right? Or if they're using their social influence to work in opposite directions. But if they have a shared sense of what the families, where the family's, wealth and influence are directed, then they can accomplish a lot together and live in harmony together too, right? So harmony, along with loyalty, was something that was prized in marriage. And I think that virtue also gives us a sense of the kind of power or authority that women had within marriage as well, right? It wasn't only expected that women were supposed to go along with what their husband said, although there was a sense that that would be nice, but there was a sense that if the marriage was a good marriage, they could both come to see their interests in a way that that they could work together for what was mutually beneficial. All right, here's some marriage advice actually from our same philosopher, Plutarch. He says, when two notes are struck together, the melody belongs to the lower note. Similarly, every action performed in a good household is done by the agreement of the partners, but displays the leadership and decision of the husband. So Plutarch wants to hold these ideals together, right? He wants there to be a sense in which the husband is the more senior member of the family, and husbands did tend to be 5 to 10 years older than their wives, right? So they did have a sort of, there was a sort of hierarchy of age in the ancient world, and they had that in their column, right? So the ideal was that the husbands had a sort of, that they would appear to be leaders in the household, at least, but I think appear to be is an important part of that, right? If women could defer to their husbands, that did not mean that women actually didn't still have control over their property, weren't still decision makers with respect to their own business affairs and so forth. But there was a desire that there be a harmonious interaction between husband and wife. And so figuring out how to do that, I think, was a big question for people in those days. And it's one reason why Plutarch writes this treatise that he does about harmony in marriage, because it's not easy, right? It's not as easy as saying, well, men are simply in charge and women do whatever they need to, but you actually have to, there's more to say about it than simply that, because of the social situation that they were in. Let me tell you another story. And Plutarch himself is the one who tells this story, praising a woman who we only know as the wife of Pythes. Pythes was a greedy and foolish leader, but his wife was quite wise. And she was self-controlled and did better for her community than her husband did. The very end of her story ends with her husband sort of giving up and retiring to an island. And here's how Plutarch closes the, oh dear, what happened? I think I'm skipping a slide for some reason. Okay, well, let me just, oh, wait, there it is. Sorry, I don't know if that's me or the slide thing. All right, this is the way Pythes' life ends. It says, or the story ends, it says, he passed the remainder of his life in this way, and his wife administered the government excellently and gave the citizens relief from their miseries. So Plutarch's wife, or Pythes' wife rather, takes over the administration of the government in his retirement, and she is clearly accepted, at least as the by the people themselves in doing that. So here we have a case where it's the same author, right, Plutarch, who is saying, you know, the leadership of the husband should sort of direct the way that the family goes, but at the same time, he's praising this woman who is able to see to the good of her community, even though her husband doesn't really want to do that in a very good way himself. Holding those tensions together, I think, is the important thing to see about the ancient world, that they wanted both things to be true at the same time. In an ideal situation, Pythes would have been a better leader, right? And then things would have looked better from the outside. But in the absence of that, it's still a good thing that his wife had the qualities that he was missing as a leader. And she was the one who was able to step in and do the job that he would not do. All right, so let me go back and say, before I go into the next slide, that we've got these three virtues: modesty, industry, and loyalty. And the way that they work together is that there isn't simply one of them that's important and the others are not important, right? So a woman who might go out of her way as a leader in some ways, as in our community, like the wife of Pythes, she might appear to be immodest by some people's viewpoint, but she has these other qualities, right? She has industry, she's looking out for her community, she is loyal to her husband in a way, but she's loyal to her city and people at the same time. And so it's the sort of complex interaction between the virtues that is important, right? They are not a straitjacket for ancient women that says you can't do anything, but the virtues themselves actually support the active roles that women were playing at the time period. Any questions?
We have a question in the classroom.
Okay, great.
Just one question. Were these arranged marriages?
Oh yeah, great question. Were they arranged marriages?
Do you want an answer?
Yeah, yes. They were. The parents did have a lot of say in selecting the spouse for their children, both for the men and for the women, by the way. But it was also the case that consent was actually the definition of marriage, was the consent of the two parties to be married to one another. You didn't have to go before a judge or get anybody to sign a form. in Roman law to be married. You just had to have two people who consented to be married together. And if they stopped consenting to be married together, then they were no longer married, they were divorced. You didn't need to go before a judge for that either. So I want to hold both of those things together, that yes, it's arranged in a way that we think of it, like they didn't have a sense of, find your true love and marry that person. And that marriage was for the families often. And a beneficial marriage was one that would align your family with another family that would help you in every way, socially and economically and all of that. But that didn't mean that that the two parties didn't have some role in actually consenting to it, and that their desire to be married was also a really important part of the situation. So they couldn't really be forced to marry exactly. Although of course the pressure of their families could make it feel that way, depending on the situation.
Can you hear me? I think, can you hear me? I think if you
yeah.
So the element of status was very prevalent at that point in time, in the Roman times. Definitely,
yeah. Status was one of the main considerations that people had in a lot of things that they did, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your question. Anybody else? Okay. All right, so let's go on and talk about, go back to the virtue of modesty and talk about another reason why, how we might explain this variety of evidence that we see of what women are doing in the ancient period. And that is that domestic virtues were civic virtues. So the word modesty that I've been talking about, sophrosyne or self-control, is really, I would say, the ability to see the good of the whole rather than simply to pursue your own interests. That idea that you're not simply about seeking status, right? If your life were only about that, it's important, but if your life were only about that, then all you would want to do is, amass wealth and power, right? But that's not good for everyone. And people were very aware of that in this period of time. And so cultivating self-control became a very important part of the picture. Let me tell you another part of the story of the wife of Pythes. So the early part of the story is quite funny, really. Her husband actually is quite greedy. He's the ruler of their territory, but gold is discovered in that territory, and he basically forgives everything else and makes all of the people go to work mining gold. And the people are very upset about this. Their lives are miserable. They don't have time for farming and other important business things that they used to do. They're just mining all the time. And they appeal to his wife. They probably see that she's a sensible person. They appeal to his wife and want help. And so she hatches a plan. And one night for dinner, when Pythes comes and sits down for dinner, she serves him little golden replicas of food. And at first he thinks, haha, that's funny. But then he realized that that's all there is to eat for dinner, sorry. And she says, well, that's all we have. Like, your people are not farming. We've just got gold, and this is what you've done. So, eat up. Like, this is the results of your labors. And he realizes at this point that he has made a mistake. And he allows at least some of the people, a majority of the people, to go back to work so that there's still some gold mining going on, but there's also some farming and other things. And, people are very happy and thankful to his wife. So that's the first vignette in the story that shows her wisdom, right? But this idea of self-control, Pythes himself is self-indulgent, right? He's greedy. He sees gold as the goal for everything. And that isn't just a problem for him, right? It interferes with the whole community and the way that it's able to function. So his wife, who is the self-controlled person, is actually the better ruler because she's able to see the good of the whole people. So I want to relate this specifically to the women's virtues, like back to what we talked about with modesty and clothing, right? It's on a smaller scale, but it's the same idea that if you're dressing simply, what you're conveying is a sense that the resources are available for the good of the family and the community, not just your own personal use. And similarly, in a way, when sexual modesty was the same thing. If you had sexual desire for someone, you know, and that went astray, it could tear a family apart, whether you're male or female. So the desire to control one's own sexual impulses was then also along the same lines of like looking at the good of the whole rather than your own personal desires. So one thing about the social context at this period was that the Emperor Augustus was a new thing in the Roman world. They hadn't had an emperor before. They had a more republican form of government prior to that, where the leadership changed regularly, often every year or every 2 years. And so after a series of civil war, though Rome did move to having an emperor as a form of stability, which it was. The Emperor Augustus ruled for a long time, and there was much more peace during that period than there had been previously. But people were concerned about having an emperor, right? What would it mean to have one person who was in control of so much and had that much power? And so this turn to these classic household virtues was one of the ways I think that they convinced themselves that having an emperor would be all right, and that they tried to cultivate an emperor who would have the right sorts of qualities, right? You don't want an emperor who's a tyrant. And they were very concerned about tyranny as a result of the move towards an emperor. You don't want Pipes to be your emperor, right? You want somebody with the qualities like his wife has. And so the emperor himself began to publicize the importance of these qualities and to say that he himself was like this kind of person, right? He was loyal to his family. He was devoted to the good of the people. He was the father of the country. So using kind of familial language for the political scene as well. And so during this period, one of the reasons why I think in a way it becomes more possible for women to take on civic roles like the ones that we saw them taking on last time is because these virtues, which are already classically women's virtues, also become qualifications, if you will, for civic leaders. And so it connects things that we know women are, we assume women are also good at to the kinds of civic roles that they were playing in that period of time. All right, so here's our summary of the ancient context. Modesty was an ideal virtue for women in this period, but we shouldn't imagine that as a sort of straitjacket, those virtues where women were only able to stay home and be good and devoted wives and mothers. They actually had important roles to play in the community, and their wisdom and action were valued because of the virtues, not simply despite them. So those virtues themselves are more complex social roles than they might have appeared to us from the outside. So I hope that the context gives you some sense of how women are able to take on leadership roles, and they're not doing that in ways that contradict being good, virtuous women, right? But that's actually part of the role at the time of what it meant to be virtuous. All right, so if you have questions about the ancient context now, maybe we could take a few more questions about that and then look at the New Testament. What do you think? Anybody in the big classroom have questions? I can see other people if they raise their hand, but it's harder to see you because we're very small.
No questions from here, Susan.
Okay, cool, thanks. All right, so let's look at some New Testament passages, and I wanted to focus on 1 Timothy, which is, 1 Timothy 2 is one of the places where we find some of the most restrictive language, or at least it sounds that way to us, about women, because it's the part that asks women to be silent in the churches. And next week, I want to talk more specifically about silence and speech. So we won't look at that portion of 1 Timothy today in particular, but I want to look at the part that comes before it and then part that comes right after it. So this may sound like familiar language. The author says, women should dress themselves modestly and decently in suitable clothing, not with their hair braided or with gold, pearls, or expensive clothes, but with good works, as is proper for women who profess reverence for God. So the idea of modesty here comes through. The word modesty appears in this verse. That same word, Greek word sophrosune, appears there in verse 9. And it also appears in verse 15 of the same portion, sort of bookends the beginning and end of this portion of 1 Timothy that pertains to women in particular. But what we see in this is the focus on hair, right? Clothing, adornment, physical adornment, and the way that that pertains to modesty. So women should, the author is saying, should display modesty in the way that they dress. And this is a very common virtue of the time, right? This would not surprise anyone or sound strange. It wouldn't sound restrictive. It would just be like, oh yeah, we know that this is what good women do, is to dress in a way that conveys that they are self-controlled people. And so as a whole, I think that's what the letter of 1 Timothy conveys, is the same sorts of leadership virtues come through time and time again. The self-controlled use of household resources, the ability to look to the good of the whole rather than to one's own individual interests and so forth. And that these are actually not just personal religious qualities, but qualities of the leaders within the group, right? When you're looking for a religious leader, who do you turn to? Well, it's going to be the people that have those qualities. And that's why in chapter 3 of 1 Timothy, we see these same qualities coming up again. So we'll start with the beginning of chapter 3, which is the instructions about a bishop. Now, a bishop must be above reproach, married only once, temperate, sensible, respectable, hospitable, an apt teacher, not a drunkard, not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, and not a lover of money. He must manage his own household well, keeping his children submissive and respectful in every way. So the word sensible, I underline that because that's actually the same word, sophron, right? The self-controlled person. They translated it as sensible, which I don't really understand. I mean, yeah, that is a sensible thing to do. I guess I can understand that. But I think self-controlled would actually have been a more straightforward translation, and would help connect the parts of Timothy if it were translated in a consistent way. But other than sensible, you might see here that many of these qualities of the bishop relate to the same idea of self-control, right? He should be not a drunkard, for example, right? Not someone who gets carried away with drink, not violent, but gentle, right? So also not carried away by anger, you might say. This was a conventional part of self-control, was thinking about anger, greed, sex, drink, food, all of those things. So showing that one can control one's own desires of all of these various kinds. So not only the bishop, but also both male and female deacons are qualified by the same set of virtues. And after a few verses intervene, we get these verses about deacons. Deacons must likewise be serious, not double-tongued, not indulging in much wine, not greedy for money, They must hold fast to the mystery of faith with a clear conscience. Women likewise must be serious, not slanderers, but temperate, faithful in all things. Let deacons be married only once, and let them manage their children and their households well. So the thing I want to point out to you here is how the parallel is between deacons and women deacons in this passage. So first, they both have to be serious, right? That's the first thing that's mentioned. For male deacons, it says not double-tongued, and for women deacons, not slanderers, right? So there's something about speech and self-control that is important there. Then not indulging in much wine as a parallel to temperate, not greedy for money as a parallel to faithful in all things, or really, I think a better translation would be trustworthy in all things. So we see that the same set of qualities shape both the appointment of male and female deacons. But you'll also notice that these are exactly the same kinds of qualities that were found in the bishop, and they all relate to this overall category of self-control, right? Being able to control your tongue, being able to control how much you drink, your desire for money, and so forth. Now, in each case, we also get this category at the very end, right? We have let deacons be married only once, which was something that we saw with the bishops as well. And there's also language about managing the children in your households as well. So, but this is also part of the same category of thinking about self-control, right? Is that it's not simply about yourself. It's about the way that the household functions together as a whole. Being faithful and loyal in marriage is not exactly the same virtue, but it is related in some ways, right? Because just the desire to divorce your spouse and find a new one, for greener pastures, if you will, was a problem, especially among elite households. So a single marriage that was strong was really valued at the time. And then simply the way that one would use your wisdom in managing the children and the household was a way of showing that you were a self-controlled person.
Excuse me, I have a question.
Yeah, great, go for it.
So a line that we're seeing here that we didn't see in the last slide, and honestly that I've never seen or noticed in any of the studies we've ever done, is the one that said they must hold fast to the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience. I haven't seen that wording before, and I'm intrigued by it. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Oh, yeah. Well, it's a good question.
It's okay.
I don't know that I can. I mean, I think I think it's a way that the author is expressing being a faithful person, like being someone that you would turn to for religious understanding, right? It is a really interesting and kind of beautiful way of phrasing that, right? Hold fast to the mystery of faith with a clear conscience. I like that there's a mystery language in there. It's not like just the tenets of faith or something like that, but the mystery of faith, like it's a complex thing and not just easy to understand. And it's not as if deacons have to have all of it under control, right? Because there's a mysterious element to it, but that they have a clear conscience about it too, or maybe I would just say like clear thinking about it in a way. You're right, that it is an interesting part that intervenes in there. And it's it's clear that that what is desired of male and female deacons is not simply that they are self-controlled, but that they also have a deep and abiding relationship to faith, and that they can communicate that to other people too, which is the part that follows verse 12 there, is about being able to speak about the gospel in a way that's powerful also is what's expected or hoped for of deacons. Yeah, great question. Other questions that you have?
More questions. Good.
What was the life expectancy of women at the time?
Great question. So it doesn't seem to be that different for men and women. About age 30 to 35 is the overall life expectancy, but that's in part because about, well, a large proportion of people died before the age of 5, right? Childhood illnesses in, well, anything other than modern cultures is really serious, right? I think in some estimates, up to half of people die before they were age 5. So you can imagine, you know, and that's why they imagine that even in order for the population to be consistent in this period of time, that each woman would have to have about 5 pregnancies in order to even just kind of break even in terms of the population. So what that means, though, is that if 30 to 35 is the average life expectancy, there actually are quite a lot of people who live to be, you know, 40, 50, 60 years old in order to balance out that discrepancy, right? So it's not as if people really expected to die at age 30 or 35 if they manage to live through their childhood. Yeah.
Only once, and I know you touched upon not wanting the ones who divorced to marry elsewhere, but were second marriages, especially if widowed or widower, were they not seen as wise to prevent wealth elimination or divisions, or were they okay?
Yeah, great question. So second marriages were actually encouraged in a lot of ways. They were certainly encouraged by the Roman government, which there were some incentives actually to be married. And partly, I think, just to produce heirs for the, you know, produce citizens, but also I think because there was this sense that marriage was the stable foundation of society. And if people were married and there were good marriages, then that meant that the society would function well also. And it also showed, again, that the emperor really supported those virtues, right? To actually have the emperor come through with legislation that encouraged that. So second marriages actually were not forbidden in any way. So there's a tension in a way between the desire for being married only once, which was also a Roman virtue, not just a Christian one, married only once, but also getting married again if you could. I think the virtue in being married only once that people saw is that, as many of us know, if you get married, if you get married a second time, even if your spouse has died and it's not a divorce, it can just be complicated, right? You've got stepchildren and parents, and you've got finances that might be partly tied to your first set of family members and then your second set of family members. And it just gets a little more complicated than if you're just one family, right? And ancient people certainly recognized that too and saw that complexity as something that was difficult to overcome. But it did not stop them from getting married again. And I think mostly it's wealthier women who are able to get married a second time and who do for the most part. And many women were not desirable that much as a spouse, and as a second, you know, a spouse the second time, we're not likely to get remarried. There's some evidence where we have evidence like that in Egypt, that there were often households that were headed by women, or where women lived together, and there weren't a lot of men in the household at all, right? So you can imagine that there were lots of possibilities for those women. Remember that married women own their own property and that they can inherit from their husband when the husband dies too. So we shouldn't think of widows as bereft of all property, right? Or really distraught because they don't have a husband. I think in the New Testament, we've often portrayed widows in that way. Poor women, you know, would be poor still, right? So they would still need support if they were widows, maybe more so than if they had a husband who also could work. But many women would not have experienced a dramatic decline in their standard of living if they were widowed. And some of them would be appealing as somebody that might want to get married again.
I have a question. Is it possible that this description of the responsibilities of the bishop to be sensible had some element of either financial, fiscal sensibility or organizational sensibility rather than just self-control?
Well, I mean, that word is a very open-ended word, self-controlled. But I do think they mean for it to pertain to money as well, in the case of the bishop. And clearly here also, where it says not greedy for money. But the bishop also, it says should not be a lover of money. So I think that financial stewardship is certainly part of what they had in mind with these leaders in these early church communities. And, you know, we don't really know at all what they did, what their jobs were within the early church. So it's very hard to make any decisions about that, but we can see what kinds of qualities were desirable, and faithful stewardship of resources is an important one for sure. So one of the things I want you to see here is that it's the same qualifications and modesty in particular, self-control in particular, that is both a gendered virtue for women in 1 Timothy 2, and also a qualification for their leadership. So back in when we read 1 Timothy 2 and we think about the dress and hair language, and then especially being followed by the silence language, it looks to us like that's just a negative thing, right? It's just a restrictive thing, the idea that women should be modest. But if we keep reading and we get to chapter 3, what we see is that modesty is also a qualification for leadership in the same community of faith. It's not simply something that restricts women's lives. And I think that's the exact same tension that we see in the culture at large, that these virtues are actually not simply restrictive of women, but they are, but they lead them into doing good and active and important things as well. So I want to give you one more slide, also from 1 Timothy. This is from chapter 5. Can somebody tell me what time it is? Because I forgot my watch, and I can't see it on my screen.
10:30.
10:30.
Oh, it's 10:30 already. All right. Well, we'll have to save the other slide for next time then, won't we? It's been such a delight to be with you all again. The time just flies.
Thank you.
Thank you.